I've never had a pure manual lens before. This is my first one mainly because of its price. I got myself a Micro Four Thirds camera recently because it seems like a very fun system that allows you to use some very budget-friendly manual lenses, including this one, the Neewer 35mm F1.7 prime lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras, like my Panasonic G7. Let's get started. The video you just saw was completely filmed with the Panasonic G7, a 5-year-old camera, and the Neewer 35mm F1.7. As you can see, you don't really need super expensive gear to get not too bad footage. At less than $70, this lens definitely outperformed my expectations, actually in a lot of ways. First, image quality. This lens is super sharp, even at its widest aperture at f1.7. At least the center is very sharp. I know some people will look for corner sharpness as well, but since this lens on the Micro Four Thirds camera is equivalent to 70mm full frame, this is more like a portrait lens that at least I don't usually look for corner sharpness. I use my cameras mainly for videos, and extreme sharpness actually is not something I'm looking for. Sometimes a lens with less sharpness will actually make it more of a film look. With the aperture of f1.7, you will be able to get a very good low light performance. Here's a sample comparing the kit lens at 35mm f5.5 with the same ISO to the Neewer f1.7. The background blur of this lens is also very impressive. At 70mm equivalent compared to a full-frame camera, the compression is really nice. If you set it at f1.7, the background is basically completely blurred out. But this can be a good thing and a bad thing. Since we're talking about background blur, let's talk about the bokeh. At f1.7 wide open, the bokeh is very nice and round. There is no weird onion ring around the bokeh, and that is absolutely amazing. Even if you stop it down, the bokeh is still relatively round. You can tell by looking into the aperture blades inside the lens. They stay pretty round even when you stop down the f-stop. Another very impressive thing of this lens is the build quality. The lens is completely made of metal and it has a very nice weight. I was so surprised that the lens cap is made of metal as well, just not the back cap. The focus ring and aperture rings are very smooth. It has a D-click aperture ring, so you can change the aperture smoothly instead of the stepping aperture on most of the photography lenses. The aperture ring is very smooth, except it feels a little stiffer in the middle for some reason, but overall very smooth. The focus ring is even smoother. It has about 180-degree focus throw. That means you will need to turn the focus ring at about 180 degrees to focus from the closest to the furthest. That is very good for a manual focus lens because it is easier to focus with a longer focus throw. If it is too short, a slight turn will make your image out of focus. It was a joy using this lens on the Panasonic G7 or any camera with focus peaking. I would say don't get this lens if your camera doesn't have good focus peaking, or else it will be very hard to focus with this lens. It is especially difficult to focus manually without focus peaking at f1.7 because the focus area is so shallow that it will be very hard to tell exactly what part is in focus. I would suggest you to stop it down to about f2.8, especially if you want to use this lens for portraits. If the subject is not facing directly to the lens, one eye will be out of focus while the other one is in focus if you open the lens wide at f1.7. The Neewer 35mm F1.7 lens has a 49mm filter thread at the front, which is awesome because 49mm is almost the smallest popular filter size. Anything smaller than that will give you a hard time looking for filters. The Panasonic G7 kit lens has a 46mm filter thread. Something that I wish they can do better on this lens is very minimal. I hope they can improve their quality control because the lens that I got has some particles inside the lens, and there's no way that I can remove them. But the good thing is they don't really impact the image quality. I know it will be very difficult because in order to keep the low price tag, it is almost not reasonable to ask for higher quality control. Another thing is the heavy focus breathing when you are focusing from, let's say, far to close. It is almost like you have zoomed in. It is not a big problem for photos, but it is kind of distracting for videos. The last thing is not really a flaw, but just something you might need to consider. Since this is a complete manual lens, it will not communicate to any digital cameras. So there is no way you know what f-stop you're at when you look at the screen. You will have to look at the marking on the lens, and it will be very hard if it is dark. Also, when you're in manual mode on your camera, you don't get the suggested shutter speed that you get when you are using a lens that communicates with the camera. So you will have to try different shutter speed and see if your image is well exposed with the proper ISO. When you're using this lens, you might need to turn on the feature that allows you to take pictures or videos without a lens because the camera cannot detect the lens. That's pretty much it because I don't have too many complaints on this lens. I think it is worth a lot more than its price. I don't think you can find anything similar at less than $70 unless you go with used lenses. That's it. Those are my thoughts on the Neewer 35mm f1.7 lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras. I would highly recommend this lens for any Micro Four Thirds camera owners for both photos and videos. It is unbeatable at its price point. Having a manual lens is also a great way to practice on focusing. I know a lot of people enjoy autofocus because they are so good with all the new cameras, but practicing manual focusing is almost like driving a manual car. If one day autofocus is not working for some reason, you still have the skill to manual focus. Why not, right? We hope this video can help you to decide if you should get this lens or not. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.